Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Full-Time Professor Levy. Today we're going to be talking about hand tools versus power tools, and we're going to explore making some shop-made jigs. The power tools that we're going to talk about today are going to be the table saw and the chop saw. The hand tools that we'll talk about will be the circular saw, the jig saw, and the sawzall. The first tool that we're going to talk about is the table saw. We own a 5 horsepower saw stump table saw. One of the brilliant things about saw stump table saws is that they sense conductivity through the blade. There is this cartridge that is hanging out underneath the blade. It is spring loaded. This is the blue spring, is the spring loading of the brake. That is very hard to compress. So this sits under the blade, and when the saw senses conductivity, it kicks this aluminum cartridge up and into the blade. Our table saw is hooked up to dust collection through 2 ports, one here at the back of the blade and one underneath that is connected to the dust collection with the white PVC pipe. The saw is turned off. I'm going to, for clarity for the video, remove the dust collection and the blade guard. Now I'm going to show you some of the adjustable features on our table saw. Our table saw is equipped with a fence. Like all table saws, you're able to lift the handle and slide the fence to the left or the right. On top of the fence I have a few push sticks. The fence is also able to move to the other side of the blade, depending on what side you're needing to cut on. Most of our cutting is done on the right-hand side of the blade. The white tape along here is a tape measure that we adjust so that you don't need to measure with a tape measure. You can just look here with the indexed plexiglass and find your measurements and lock it down. Other adjustable features on the saw are the blade height, which is adjustable with this rotary lever, all the way down to nothing. Middle knob, you can lock it in place so the blade won't wander on you. On this side of the saw, on the left-hand side, with the same black rotary knob for locking, we were able to undo that, and now we can rotate the angle of the blade to the left and all the way back up to 90 degrees. The saw is also equipped with these 2 miter gauge tracks so that we can grab our miter gauge and do some sled work. This slots into those tracks like so, and that way we're able to use this as a fence and pass it by the blade. The only issue with the miter gauge is that the fence of the miter gauge doesn't come close enough to the blade to be stable. We are going to, at a later date, be investigating building our own miter gauge sled. The first thing that we're going to do is turn the table saw on. This saw is set up so that there is actually a 2-step process in order to turn the saw on. First of all, we're going to hit the power switch. This sends the saw through its boot up procedure. Now that the red light has stopped flashing, we can set the fence of the saw to the measurement that we want to cut, and then cut our piece of wood. I'm going to leave dust collection turned off for all of these demonstrations so that you can hear what I'm doing. I'm going to set this saw to rip a 3-inch strip. Now it's locked down. The first step is going to be this pedal to turn the saw on. Let the saw come to speed. Now I'm going to take a piece of lumber and we're going to send it through the table saw. I'm going to grab one of my push sticks here. I like to push sticks here on the actual fence so they're easy to reach. And I'm going to push it all the way through the blade. Turn the saw off and let it stop. The push sticks allow us to get our fingers close to the blade without risking cutting our fingers on the blade. And now you can see I've cut a nice 3-inch strip out of that piece of plywood. One of the things that I find is most important to talk about with safety on a table saw is ripping versus cross-cutting. Ripping is where you have more material against the fence than you do going widthwise. If I was to cut this piece of plywood this direction, this is what I would call cross-cutting. It's easy when you are cross-cutting to drift away from the fence, and that is when the saw will kick your material. Now that you can hear me a little bit better, I'm going to talk about the push sticks again. I have 2 different kinds of push sticks when it comes to the table saw. I have this plastic one that came with the saw. It has holes punched in it, so it's lightweight. It has this angled mouth that can sit firmly over the lumber and allows me to push it all the way through the table saw. This push stick is great. The only problem with this push stick is that it can't get very close to the blade. For that reason is why I have this push stick. This is what I call a sacrificial push stick. It didn't start out chewed up like this. It's been chewed up by the blade as we have cut more and more things. This push stick allows me to get as close to the blade as I want, even go over the top of it. I'm going to let you see me push a piece of material through the table saw, this time from the left-hand side of the fence, so you can actually see it passing through the blade, and you'll see me use the sacrificial push stick. I'm going to take my piece of lumber and make sure the blade is set just above the lumber. That'll do. You don't need too much of the blade sticking above it. Just a little bit will do. I'm going to put my material on the far side of the fence. That way, when I turn the saw on, I can't come in contact with it. I'm going to turn the saw on and push the lumber through. Making sure to keep the lumber firmly against the fence. And pushing the lumber all the way through so the blade no longer contacts it. And turning the saw off, letting it come to stop. One of the great things about this table saw, besides the fact that it has a brake, is this paddle switch to stop and start the saw. What I like about this paddle switch is that to turn the saw on, you have to pull the paddle switch towards you, which means that if you get into trouble with the saw on, you can push your leg against it to turn it off. Here we have our chop saw for our shop. The chop saw also feeds into the dust collection. The dust shoots out the back here and falls into this chute that gets vacuumed over to the dust collector. Our chop saw is a double beveled sliding compound miter saw. You pull that back to release this. Our saw has a light that it is equipped with. So this saw is very versatile. I can make a cut just like this, or I can slide it back and make a longer cut. I am able to lock it so it's unable to slide. I am also able to make several angle adjustments with the saw. I can angle this direction to 50 degrees, and I can angle the other direction to 60 degrees. The other way this saw is able to angle is over this direction or this direction. That's why it's a dual angle compound miter saw. But we left that. Most of our cuts we make at 0, and we were able to equip all of our angles with the miter, and that locks that down. The chop saw has all these registration marks for the miters on both sides. So once we depress the thumb lever, the red index will stop as it reaches 15 degrees. It'll do the same at 22.5, 30, and 45. Some other aspects of the saw that are crucial are the fence. The fence of our saw has these wing nuts, and you are able to bring this further away or closer to the blade as needed for support on both sides. And then we also have the blade guard. As you lower the saw, the guard will raise. This guard keeps debris from being able to be kicked back into the operator. I am now going to demonstrate cutting 2 different widths of materials on the chop saw. The first width that we're going to cut is narrow. When I'm lining up for a cut, I want to make sure that the saw is pushed firmly all the way back. I want to make sure my material is firmly against the fence. I'm going to line the blade, the tooth of the blade, up with where I want to cut on a piece of wood. I am careful to keep my fingers up off of the trigger for the saw while I'm lining up with the wood. This way I can avoid accidentally starting the saw. I'm going to start the saw with it above the material, let it come to speed, pass gently through the material, raise the saw so the blade is just out of the material, let my fingers off the trigger, and allow the saw to come to a stop before I let go. Here I will demonstrate. And I've cut the piece of wood into 2. Now I'm going to cut a larger piece of material. This piece of material is too wide for the saw to cut, and this is going to be our segue into the circular saw. I'm going to start the saw again. So this is quite a wide cut, but our saw is still not quite got the throat on it to be able to cut all the way through this. The options here would be to flip the piece of material over, but in this situation it's angled, so I can't make that cut. So my option here to be able to cut this is to take it to the circular saw. Here we have our Milwaukee circular saw. This circular saw is battery powered and has some of the same features that the chop saw has. It has a blade guard here. As the saw enters over a piece of material, the guard raises to allow the blade to enter the material. The saw also has a foot that with a lever we can raise and lower for different depths of cuts. And we can lock it back down. I'm going to demonstrate cutting a piece of lumber with the circ saw now. Again, we want to start with the saw away from the material, let it slowly come to speed, and then pass through the material. The next tool that we're going to talk about is a handheld tool known as a Sawzall, S-A-W-Z-A-L-L. is its generic name, or reciprocating saw is its technical name. This is a saw similar to a jigsaw, which we will also cover in a little bit, that has a blade that extends out and reciprocates up and down. Sawzalls are great for making long cuts into pieces of wood where you wouldn't ordinarily be able to use a circular saw. Now I am going to demonstrate cutting this piece of wood with the Sawzall. The Sawzall also, unlike the circular saw, allows you with a little bit of difficulty to make a curved cut. I'm going to attempt to make a little bit of a curved cut now. And here is the offcut from what I just cut, and with the Sawzall I was able to make this small curved cut, which I would not have been able to do otherwise with the circ saw. If a curved cut is what you're trying to produce, the best tool for the job will be the jigsaw. The jigsaw has a pistol grip with the red trigger. It is a corded handheld power tool. The silver, this part is the foot. The blade extends out. There are many different kinds of blades you can buy for a jigsaw. This is actually a metal blade for a jigsaw. Metal blades are very good at cutting fine circles because they are so thin. You can get them more aggressively toothed for cutting through thicker, denser, harder to cut material, or you can get them more finely for delicate scroll work. Just like with the other power tools, you want to start the jigsaw away from the material, let it come to speed, and then cut through. And we have created a nice curved cut. What we're going to do now is make a guide for the circular saw so that when we want to cut long straight lines, which can be tricky with the circular saw, we'll only have to line the edges of the guide up with where we want to cut, and we'll have a straight line every time. What I'm going to do is take that sheet of plywood, I'm going to cut an 8-inch strip and a 2-inch strip, and then we're going to glue and staple it together. We're going to do a plunge cut with the circular saw so that the edge of the board lines up with the cut every time. Over to the table saw. I'm going to set the saw on the fence at 8 inches. I'm going to turn it on, grab a piece of plywood, and make a cut. The reason that we're using plywood instead of stick goods to make this guide out of is because we know plywood came from a factory. We know that all of its edges, if it hasn't been cut before, are going to be square. Now we're going to grab the narrow crown stapler and some glue, and we're going to shoot this thing together. We're going to grab our glue bottle, come over here back to the plywood, we're going to put a nice bead of glue all the way down the board. Now that we have a nice glue bead down the length of our piece of plywood, I'm going to grab the air hose down, connect it to the narrow crown stapler, and fasten these two boards together. I'm going to start down one end, and the board will square itself as we go. I'm just pushing the top board back and forth as I go and flush it to the edge. That noise is our air compressor refilling the tank for the air that I'm using. You'll notice that I'm keeping my fingers well clear of where the narrow crown stapler can fire. What I'm going to do next here is take a rag to this, clean off the glue. Then we're going to shoot it down to the table temporarily and use the circ saw to plunge cut along it, and then we'll have a rip fence that is custom to that Milwaukee circular saw. Okay, time to clean this up. I could clamp this to the table, but it's just as quick and easy to use just 2 or 3 staples. Now that I'm done with the gun, I can retract the air hose, get it off the floor. I'm going to grab the circular saw, and we're going to cut this thing. Over to the circular saw. And now I can cut along the length of our fence. Now I can cut along the length of our fence. So this jig will only work with the short side of the faceplate of the saw. That's because of the thickness of the lumber, but that's okay. We know which side it is. I'm now going to use the guide that we just made to demonstrate cross-cutting across a sheet of OSB that needs the end squaring up. I have this sheet of OSB that we used for a subfloor for a show that I was originally going to make this saw guide out of, but when I pulled it out of the rack, I discovered that one end of it is not square. It was cut to fit the floor of the show that we used it for. So now I'm going to use the saw guide that we just made to square up the end of this sheet good that is useless to us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure from the bottom on the short side, put a mark just below it, make the same mark to the same measurement on the other side, and then I'll secure the saw guide and cut our sheet good square. So we are 91 and 5/16, so I'm just going to make a mark at 88. I'm going to put a circle around it so I can find it again. And I'm going to make my same 88-inch mark on this side. When I can, I like to mark on both sides of the tape measure. It gives me more to line up with. I'm going to grab a clamp or two from, actually I'm just going to screw it. I'm going to grab a saw guide, line it up with both marks that we just made. Because we cut this bottom piece of plywood with the circular saw, we know that the edge of it is exactly where the blade is going to stop. And with 2 screws, I'm going to protect it. 1, 2. Now I can grab my circular saw and square up this sheet. Now I'm going to remove the saw guide. We like to double check everything, so we're going to confirm our measurement. We have 88. And we have 88. So that is how and why we use a saw guide. To square up that sheet good, we wouldn't have been able to do it on the table saw because of cross-cutting. We certainly couldn't have done it on the chop saw. To scribe those lines and try to make a straight cut like that with the circ saw would have been extremely hard to accomplish precisely. With the saw guide, we've eliminated any user error. The last jig that I want to show you is called a featherboard. A featherboard is really just an extra set of fingers that I am able to clamp and screw to the saw table. You can see where the blade is. There are little reliefs cut in this piece of 1x. That allows the fingers to flex as the wood goes through, but in one direction only. I'll demonstrate without the saw being on, and then I will turn it on. So if I take my piece of wood, it's hard, I cannot pull back on it. To get it out, I have to lift up and out. So this allows, essentially, me to have my hand here without having my hand here, and keep the piece of lumber securely against the fence. Now I will turn the saw on and pass the lumber through. watch until the sauce stops so we know it is safe. And that will be the end of today's episode of Tool Time with Professor Levy. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.